Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Scanlon Center for School Mental Health Educator Wellness podcast. I am your host, Carrie Volge, saying welcome back, or welcome to those of you who are new joining us. I am actually the Director of Professional Development for both the Scanlon Center for School Mental Health and the Baker Teacher Leader Center, and this podcast has been designed to share wellness information and practices to help us lead healthier, happier personal and professional lives. And it's really geared towards and specific to K through 12 educators. And tonight we're going to be talking about one of our dimensions of wellness with Dr. Kessler. We are going to focus on our intellectual dimension of wellness with her. She is an amazing person that I actually stumbled upon online when I was reading some articles about intellectual wellness. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a background about Dr. Kessler, and then we're going to go ahead and get started. But as a reminder, if you're joining us live and if you have questions for Dr. Kessler or something about our conversation, or if you want us to touch on something that's related to our conversation or the topic this evening, then feel free to drop those questions into our chat function, and we can publish those questions and try to address those the best that we can. Okay, so Shelly, here we go. Dr. Shelli Kesler is a cognitive neuroscientist with specific expertise in neuroimaging, neuropsychology, biostatistics, machine learning, and computer programming. Her research program focuses on the neural mechanisms of chronic conditions, especially cancer-related cognitive neurotoxicities. Her work includes both clinical and preclinical studies that focus on translational approaches for measuring the functional and structural connectome, which is a word that I learned today, in both humans and animals using MR neuroimaging. The overarching goals of her work concern the neurobiologic subtyping of cognitive impairments, as well as neuroimaging-based predictions of cognitive behavioral outcomes, survival and treatment response across the lifespan, and she has obtained over 14 million in external grant funding and received tons of awards and accolades for all of the work that she has done. And we are just very thankful, Shelly, that you took the time out of your clearly extremely busy schedule to join us this evening to drop some knowledge. So thank you for joining us.
Yeah, absolutely. It's my pleasure.
Good. So one of the things that I like to do right away in these podcasts is just try to understand or learn just a little bit about your path. I think that always gives us a really good insight into what brought you to this work and how it has shaped your work and helping us better understand and give us some context. So tell us your story.
Okay. Well, I was born.
Yeah, go ahead.
All the way back. I really first became interested in neuroscience in high school, and part of it was stemming from my siblings and I have always been very artistic. We play instruments and we draw and paint. My sister is very talented at pottery. And I always was so curious how we create art and music and all the amazing things that humans do. And I knew enough even at that age that it was the brain that did those magnificent things, but it was like, how?
Right.
It's this like weird looking organ. How does it do that? And just even throughout history, the feats of art and architecture and engineering. And so I just was kind of obsessed with that. Like, how does it do it? It just doesn't make any sense, really. And that, and also the other interesting and kind of weird things that it does, like dreams. Why do we have dreams? And why are they so weird? And what do they mean? And it's so bizarre that if you don't get enough REM sleep, which is the type of sleep where dreams happen, you die. You actually die from that. So it's like dreams are necessary for, now we know they're necessary for consolidating your memories and keeping your memories healthy, but they're also somehow important for your very survival. So that's where it all started, was just this enormous curiosity about how that works and how do we figure it out. And of course, the brain is so complex that no one actually really knows.
Mhm.
So I wanted to be one of the people who tried to help figure it out a little better. And so I got a undergrad degree in psychology, the study of the mind, of course. And then I did a PhD in neuropsychology, which is more specific to brain behavior relationships. And it turned out that neuropsychology wasn't exactly the best fit for me. It's more concerned with how to describe conditions of the brain, but not really how it works. Like I wanted to take it apart and see
Mhm.
what's under the hood, how does it actually function. And so then I went on after my PhD to do postdoctoral training in cognitive neuroscience. And that's really like, that was the perfect home for me. And that field really does focus on, how does your brain do these magnificent things,
Mhm.
like remember stuff and solve problems and create. And so then in terms of what to specifically study, when I started out, I studied like most of us do in science. We study what our mentor is studying,
Oh,
and
yes.
that happened to be I worked with a very famous neuropsychologist who studied traumatic brain injury, and that was so fascinating to me because your brain can have this catastrophic injury and it'll still work pretty well
Mhm.
considering. And especially considering that when you lose a brain cell, you don't grow it back. And so that was amazing, like miraculous to me. And then when in my postdoctoral work, I studied what my mentor studied, which was neurogenetic syndromes. And that also, again, very, very interesting. And so I became very interested in, well, how does the brain recover from injuries? And then one of my mentors, introduced me to this concept of chemo brain, which
Mm.
really fit with like there's this injury, but it's people kind of don't believe in it, and that really appealed to me because uh, all these women and other patients too, and men too, were talking about these huge changes in their brain function
Yep.
after they had chemotherapy, and everyone was saying, nah, it's just stress, or that's not possible, it doesn't exist. And so that just really got me. I was like, I want to figure that out and see what's going on there. And so that's where we are, brings us today, is that's what I study, is cancer related cognitive impairment.
Okay, so we have to do a little bit of a sidestep because now I really need to know this. So, I mean, we're gonna get to some intellectual wellness stuff here down the road, but okay,
Mhm.
so my mom died of cancer, about 6 years ago, and she went through many rounds of chemo and definitely talked about and experienced this chemo brain. Fast forward then, so she died about 6 years ago, then this pandemic happened, right?
Mhm, mhm.
And then people start to talk about, like, this COVID brain,
Yep.
right? And it the when I would hear people describe this to me who experienced it, very much the same way that my mom described, in
Mhm.
many ways, her this chemo brain. So, like, can you tell us about that? And, like, are our children experiencing this? And is this showing up in schools? And if our teachers are experiencing it and they're coming
Mhm.
to schools, like, A, is it a real thing? What's
Mhm.
happening in the brain,
Mhm.
and how is it impacting our schools?
Yeah, absolutely. So we actually have done a couple of studies in COVID because we saw how similar it was to chemo brain. And it's a similar situation where you have this medical illness that doesn't originate in your brain. I primarily study breast cancer, and so it's like people say, well, why does that affect your brain?
Mhm.
And same with COVID. And so yes, it is a very real thing, and there are measurable changes in your brain from COVID, and it's most likely that people who have more significant changes in their brain are the ones who are going to have the COVID brain. And, there's always going to be a continuum there. Um, it's not well understood, of course. and because it's just so new and we're still studying it. But even though COVID is a respiratory disease, it is what's known as a neurotropic virus, which means that it can travel along nerve pathways, and it goes in your nose. And so, where is your nose attached to?
Yeah.
Your head, your brain. So you breathe things in, it gets into your brain, right into this frontal area. And most people talk about problems with what's known as executive function, which is our problem solving, our decision making, our processing speed. And those things our multitasking, and that stuff seems really befuddled in COVID brain. And so it makes sense because that's kind of the first place that it hits. And your prefrontal area also plays a role in memory and attention, and so all those things, your language, your word finding ability, right? Like how quickly you can think of words, and so all of those things are potentially affected. The other thing COVID does that probably affects the brain negatively is it causes a lot of inflammation. And so your brain is super, super sensitive to inflammation. And so inflammation can be very toxic to brain cells. So that's probably an issue as well. And so that's just mild COVID. And then when you start talking about people who had moderate to severe COVID, then you're also adding the hypoxia, the lack of oxygen from having a respiratory illness.
Yeah. So, so I'm sitting here thinking, okay, so now let's take what you just delivered to us, like what's actually happening when you have COVID or, chemo brain. And then, but if these students have had experienced COVID and experienced these things that have changed their brain in ways that, of course, impact their executive functioning skills. Same with teachers. And
Mhm.
one of the things we keep talking about, Shelly, in schools, and maybe you do or do not know this about what's going on in schools with our students right now, is that we keep coming back to this conversation of like, oh my gosh, like our seniors are acting more like sophomores and they're functioning more like sophomores and so on and so forth, right? They're like a couple years, especially emotionally, socially, intellectually seems to be lagging a little bit.
Mhm.
I'm wondering at this point, like maybe it's not just the isolation that took
Mhm.
place. Maybe there is some real, actually, scientific or biological things that are happening inside of our bodies, coupled with the isolation that just exasperated this issue,
Mhm.
that are really showing up and creating these issues that we're seeing in
Mhm.
schools. I mean, we're taking benchmarks and measures that we were using pre-COVID,
Mhm.
to determine where our students are at right now. And yeah, so I think what you're saying is ringing, kind of a lot of bells in my head in terms of what we're seeing and experience with students and even teachers
Yeah.
and how they're struggling.
Yeah. I mean, millions and millions of people were exposed to this virus, right? And so we have this unprecedented situation where so much of the population has been exposed to a potentially neurological issue. And of course, not everyone gets the neurological problems, just like not everyone had to be in the ICU or have
Right.
ventilation. But it's just we really don't know, why some people got it and what the long term effects are. Is it a acute thing? Is it going to be a chronic thing? And in terms of children, especially, their brains are still developing. Our brains continue to develop into our early 30s, and so you hit it with something like that, and you're definitely going to see some disruptions. Um,
Right.
and it's another way that it's similar to chemo brain is that obviously cancer is this, really stressful situation, a life-threatening illness, and you have to go through all these really difficult treatments. And so of course the anxiety and the stress of that situation is going to affect your brain as
Sure.
well. And then on top of that, you're having trouble with memory and thinking, and they kind of feed off of each other. And so I think that's exactly what happens too, especially with children who, don't have as strong of coping skills. I mean, I guess it depends on the adult, how their
Mhm.
coping skills are, but they don't understand some of this stuff as well. It's harder for them, and they don't know what's going on. And so their response is often to act out or
Mhm.
to have a personality change.
Mhm.
Um, and those can feed into, they, like I said, they affect each other. When you have anxiety, it affects your brain, which then releases hormones
Mhm.
and chemicals that can make the anxiety worse. And it's this big circle a lot of times.
Yeah. So that kind of feeds into like this bigger not issue, but I think topic that I'm really wanting to talk about today, which is also how to take care of our intellectual wellness, especially when something's kind of going south maybe and not working quite right.
Mhm.
So, when we're thinking about like SAMHSA's definition of what intellectual wellness is and why it's important and what it means in our lives, and as it's just recognizing the creativity and the importance of extending or expanding our learning through engaging in different kinds of community activities, cultural activities, intellectual challenges, so on and so forth. And so, one of the things that I'm thinking of as you're talking is, okay, so you're experiencing what we would call chemo brain or COVID brain, let's say, or maybe there's some other things that are happening. You've experienced a traumatic event that's
Mhm.
creating some some issues in your life. What would you like? Is it possible then to engage in different kinds of activities or challenges that actually reverses things? I guess maybe is what I'm trying to say,
Yeah.
or that things that are happening in your brain.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny in our society how we consider that our mind and our body is somehow separate, and it has this history, right? Like
Mhm.
early modern philosophers like Descartes and his peers started talking about mind body dualism and how, and their way of trying to figure out how physiology worked. And that's kind of been a pervasive theme. And then you also have the three main religions in the world: Islam, Judaism, Christianity, believe that our bodies are inhabited by a soul. And so we have like the majority of the population with religious and or philosophical beliefs that they're two separate entities. And so you have this, you don't have any problem going to get a treatment for a broken arm or a bad heart, but we're real skeptical about needing treatment for mental health, for cognitive issues, for depression or anxiety, because we think that it subconsciously, that it means there's a weakness of our soul or our spirit. And it's kind of this collective belief that we often don't realize but still pervades in our society. And so I think one of the first things is to is having this open uh, dialogue and maybe an openness to taking care of our minds, if that makes any sense. That's always
Yeah.
kind of the first step that I have to work on with patients uh, who are having these struggles, because it's, you think I should just will myself out of this, and if I just try harder, then it'll be fine. And so I think the very first step is recognizing this and recognizing that your mind stems from your brain, which is part of your body. And
Yeah.
just like when we break our arm, our brain can become injured by our circumstances, by trauma, as you mentioned, by illness, by disease. And the problem is you can't put it in a sling like your arm. You have to keep using it. And
Mhm.
so we have to engage in certain behaviors that help it. But yeah, the long-winded answer to your question is yes, there are many things you can do to strengthen your brain, to potentially even reverse damage. You can't, like I said, ever get brain cells back that you've lost, but you continually make new ones. And
Mm.
there are things you can do that make that process happen more quickly. And there are things you can do that strengthen what you do have and maintain what you do have.
Okay, so there's a couple things that I want to talk about after listening to that, what you just said. So first, what are those things? So like what are some challenges or some activities that
Mhm.
you would maybe prescribe or
Mhm.
suggest to somebody?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So the best thing to do, of course, which is always going to be the hardest because we don't have time or motivation a lot of times, but you really have to combine two things for your brain health. One is physical activity. So aerobic exercise causes new brain cells to form. And it, reduces inflammation. It has all these other properties that are good for our brain. So we engage in some physical exercise. It doesn't have to be crazy. Go for a walk, and you're going to get some new brain cells. Then the problem, though, with that is about 50% of them just die after you've made them. So
Really?
yeah,
How
yeah.
what? So how quickly do they die?
Pretty quickly within days.
Why?
I I don't know. I think because they're like these new baby brain cells, and when
Ah.
they don't have a purpose and you're coming in, I think of it as kind of like, this a child who's born and their next sibling is like 12 years older than them or something. Like that family structure is already doing its thing, and now you're introducing this really new person. And it's kind of like that with these little baby brain cells. Your brain has been formed and reorganized like over many years if you're an adult. And when they come there's like no real place for them to fit in. And so how we get them to fit in is through the mental exercise. That is what wires them into place. And so that's why the two things
Mhm.
are important to do together.
So, like, when you say mental exercise, are you talking about, like, learning a new language, learning how to play an instrument, doing crossword puzzles? Like, are those the types of mental exercises are you, like, encouraging people to engage in?
Yep, exactly. And there's not one that is going to be best for everyone. Of course, you need to pick something that you like enough to keep doing regularly. The key is not necessarily what the thing is that you do, but that you can do it regularly, like every day, 10 or every other day, or so that it's like a part of your routine, a
Mhm.
habit. And so the two very best things for your brain are going to be learning a language and learning music. And that's because they use all of your brain. And so that's just going to be the best exercise, but not everyone wants to do that. And the
Mhm.
other thing I would say about those two, is you don't have to become fluent in a new language.
Oh,
If
thank
you're
God.
learning, yeah, exactly. Even like,
That's not happening.
yeah, right. A few times a week, you're learning a couple new vocabulary words, a couple new phrases. That is enough to challenge your brain because it's hard. And so that's enough. We don't have to become, polyglots to have this work. Same with musical instrument. You don't have to go on tour with a rock band to have this work. You just find something that fits into your lifestyle that's small. And then there's those, like I said, are the top tier things.
Mhm.
And then you have so many other things too. One of the things I find works really well for a large variety of people is what I call active journaling. And so most people understand what keeping a diary or a journal is, but
Mhm.
in this type of journaling, you're not just writing, oh, today I did the laundry and I went to work and I saw my
Mhm.
friend. You're writing about something you did, and then you're kind of analyzing it and saying, this is what it meant to me, or this is what I learned from it. This is how I felt about it. So you're really kind of diving deep. And the other part of that is you can't just what's the word, stream of consciousness.
Okay,
You
yeah.
have to be very focused, like you're kind of writing a term paper
Mhm.
that someone else will read, and you want to use good grammar, good spelling, good sentence structure,
Yeah.
all of those things to like challenge your brain to communicate and to express itself. And that
Okay.
works really well.
I just wanna make sure I'm getting this straight because I wanna do it right, because that's the kind of person I am, Shelly. Like, I know the formula and I gotta do it right. So, like, okay, I'm a runner, so I run 6 days a week. So,
Nice.
after I run, in order to, like, try to keep as many of those brain cells that my body is creating, because
Uh-huh.
I like, that image to me of, like, those brain cells die, like, 50% of those brain cells dying, I don't know, that kinda shook me a little.
Mhm.
So then I come back from my run, and then you're telling us that, like, pretty much is it, like, right away we should engage right after physical activity in these exercises and these intellectual exercises? Or can we wait? I mean, is it okay to wait like 2, 3, 4 hours and
Oh,
then it's totally fine.
oh, yeah. Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. And, there no one knows exactly how quickly. It's definitely sooner than you would think. And so I tell people, try to do these health things, every day if you can, even if it's 5 minutes.
Mhm.
And it doesn't have to be right after. Some people want to do those together, and there are like certain exercise-based games, cognitive games that people
Yeah.
do, and so they get them both at the same time. But if you're doing one in the morning and one later in the day, that's fine, or even the next day. Yeah.
Okay.
The key really is regularity.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you said something else too when you were talking about religion that I thought was really interesting, that you even brought religion into it, because that's super fascinating to me. I have never thought about it the way that you just described it, like how when we separate the two, how that can change like our feelings or thoughts or about brain health and our body health,
Mhm,
and
mhm,
whether or not they are connected or not. And so it took me to when I was, doing research and reading and prepping for this particular podcast, I came across a bunch of information that was basically talking about intellectual wellness in a way that's like it's not just like the physical, dimension and pairing that with like these intellectual challenges, but like it's also really important for the person to come to this work, this self work with having not necessarily just an open mind, but an ability an ability and even a desire to receive information that maybe even challenges your current beliefs,
mhm,
and your whole own personal bias.
mhm.
And like that even like takes it, that's like a new dimension or takes it up another notch. Like, have you dabbled in that, or have you talked about that with people, or what are your thoughts on that?
I definitely. And so it kind of it brings up a couple of things for me. One is this concept of cognitive reserve, where when we're doing these mental exercises regularly, we actually start stacking up reserve in our brain. And in some cases it's more brain cells, in some cases it's just a more efficient wiring of the brain, but it works exactly like money in your bank. If there's a recession and you've had a savings account, you're going to come through it okay. If you have good cognitive reserve and you get an illness or an injury, you're going to come through it much better than someone who doesn't have cognitive reserve. And cognitive reserve is tied really, really closely to education. And so people who are more educated have more cognitive reserve, but it's more so than just, oh, I went to school. It seems to be about your experiences in life and I'm having trouble explaining it, sorry, but like the breadth of your experiences, the diversity of
Mhm.
experiences is what I'm trying to say. The diversity of the people, the diversity of the things you've been exposed to. And we know that people who have more diverse experiences tend to be more empathetic,
Yep,
right? To
absolutely.
different points of views, to different lifestyles, uh, to different ways of thinking. And so that when I think about that, I'm like you, it's just so good for your brain to have that diversity of experience and of education. And so I definitely talk to people about trying to expand their horizons, to be cliche. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, we are really fortunate in the college. We have we one of the centers that I co-direct, the Baker Teacher Leader Center. is named after Linda Baker, and she, is a donor and donated the funds to start the center and keep it going. And she is such a believer in the research behind making sure that our students have these diverse experiences, that she has created scholarships and systems and ways for students to go abroad and study abroad and scholarship them. So it's not just for the haves and the have-nots, but like understanding that putting yourself in these situations, it is such a deep and rich, life-changing learning experience, educational experience, that it's something that you just can't get out of a textbook or in a classroom. And those things are great too, and engaging in difficult conversations with classmates or peers or faculty, but also like that traveling experience is something I think that you were kind of alluding to or speaking to.
Absolutely.
You can see that in K through 12 students though too. Like you can have students who, the same IQ range or whatever, we're in going through the same school and interacting with the same, students and teachers. And it's always really clear to me when I go into K through 12 schools who has had life experiences.
Yeah.
And there's a variety of what those life experiences are, right?
Mhm, mhm,
Like what neighborhood you live in and
mhm,
how much you've traveled and the things that you visited and seen and the kind of culture that your family exposes you to.
mhm.
Yeah, it's super interesting.
Yeah.
So,
And part of that, at its foundation is literally the difficulty. You know,
yep.
I mean, talking to someone who has a different opinion than you or a different belief than you, there's a difficulty there, like an emotional and an intellectual difficulty.
Mhm.
And doing it with grace and with openness, you learn from that difficulty, you benefit from that difficulty. Traveling to a foreign country is really difficult,
Oh,
and
yeah.
once you make it through that, you have this new strength, just like lifting weights. It's the same for your brain. And it reminds me of when I worked in pediatric cancer. I noticed this major trend that the children who had cancer, even if it was the same disease, I could always tell the ones whose families were more open to diversity of experience. And those kids were so much more resilient.
Mhm.
And the ones who were really like, I want to say overprotective and restrictive, those kids really struggled.
Yeah.
And it came out also too in like as they were trying to go through their recovery, the parents would not make them do anything, wouldn't make them do their homework, wouldn't make them do their chores, kind of tried to remove, because they were so scared. I mean, I get it, I totally get it. They would remove all of those challenges from them, and those kids just floundered
Mhm.
without that, without those challenges. They really struggled.
Oh my gosh, Shelly, like you just opened up like a can of worms for me. I mean, not really a can of worms, but I have been thinking about this. And I think educators across the board have been thinking about this for quite a while, but particularly since the pandemic, this resiliency piece.
Mhm.
It is so apparent. And, I think there's multiple factors that, we need to think about that have influenced like the resiliency of our students right now. But it is very apparent. I mean, even with my own children, to be honest, like, um, I think it's something that we're going to start to have to really spend a lot of time on. And, and I get it. Like, there's people who speak to this and we talk about how, you know, um, we were the latchkey kids, like I was, right? So I came home. My parents were super, to be honest, like great. I mean, honestly, like particularly my mom, wonderful, but also very hands off.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah,
like, we had to learn to self soothe and to
yep.
figure things out and, to pick ourselves up and keep going. And there wasn't a lot of space for like, box breathing in my house. In fact, emotions didn't exist a lot of times, to be honest. And now this is the space I'm working
Same,
in.
same, yeah.
But then we had kids, right? And I think a lot of our natural instinct has been to be like these helicopter parents because it's like we're trying to protect our kids and not, and I'm overgeneralizing right now, but
Right, of course.
But like then it was like we didn't want our kids to have that experience. Like we wanted to be there for them. We wanted to coach them through things. We wanted to be on their side and guide them through things. But what's
Mhm.
happened is I think we've like overcorrected in many ways, especially maybe during the pandemic.
Mhm.
And I think that you can really see this in some of our students. And
Mhm.
it's something we're going to have to kind of deal with. Well, that we are even seeing, having to deal with and having to work on with our students in higher ed for
Mhm.
sure.
Yeah. No, my colleagues and I talk about this issue all the time at, the undergrad and the graduate level. We're like, what's going on with the students? Like they're helpless. I'm like, I don't trust them to go out into the world and be able to be okay. Like I'm really worried about what's going on here. And yeah, I think we have to change the way, at least I definitely have, over my career, had to change the way that I teach
Me
and
too.
the way that I interact with students, because they're just very different.
They are very different. And I think in some ways, like, I'm not trying to pick on them either because some of the things that I see from my students and even from my own children and their friends and some of the kids that I work with in schools are amazing. I mean, some
Mhm.
of them I'm just like, yeah, you guys are badass. But then there's these other things that I think, and I am totally blaming myself for this too. I see this in my parenting and I see how it's impacted even the development of my children. And if I could rewind and go back and not be so hands-on all the time,
Mhm.
I totally would. That's the one thing that I would definitely change about my parenting when I was raising my children because I think, yeah, it's definitely had an impact for sure.
Yeah. And those things are so hard to predict. Like it's coming from this place of like love and protection
Mhm,
and how you want to be treated as a person.
mhm.
And you just have no idea. So it's so hard.
It's hard. I mean, they don't like we always talk about, they don't come with a manual, right? And,
Exactly.
I really was doing my best and what I thought was my best, and I think we all do. We all do that.
Mhm.
We all love our kids and do our best, but yeah, that is, I think, an outcome of us, of our generation of helicopter parenting for sure. I don't know,
Shoot.
so I know, shoot, darn it. Now we get to see how they're gonna mess up their kids.
Yeah.
Just in a different way, it's fine.
Yeah. It'll be awesome.
I remember after I had my first baby, I was sitting on the end of my bed, like, I had gotten home that day, and I remember just thinking to myself, I can't believe they let me go home with a baby. Like, who do they think I am to be able to take care of a baby? And I
There
was
was no evaluation
like,
before.
"What? I didn't have to take a test? Like, what?" And I'm sitting on the end of my bed and I'm sobbing, and my mom comes over and she was like, "What is wrong?" And I'm like, "I'm gonna mess him up. I don't know what I'm doing." And she was like, "Oh, yeah, you are gonna mess him up. It's fine." She's like, "I messed you up. I messed your siblings up. It's fine. We just do our best." It's just to what degree are you gonna mess him up?
And we all turn out okay, right?
Yeah, it's
That's the thing.
yeah, I don't know. In that moment, it made me chuckle and it maybe kind of pushed me through that moment. So I'm
Yeah.
thankful that she kind of made a joke, but not really, to be honest.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's the one of the things that I just love so much and I'm so fascinated by about the brain is how adaptable it is.
That's true.
Like
Mhm.
we adapt to really incredible things.
Yeah,
Yeah, but resilience, yeah, I think is we're having to really rethink that and how we can help students gain some or improve, what they do have.
yeah.
Absolutely.
So, ending on that a little bit, I'm gonna ask you one more question, and this is kind of a takeaway. If you were gonna give our educators who are joining us this evening or who maybe, listen to the podcast later on, through Spotify or Apple, Kat, if I think you're with me, I don't even remember what outlets we're on right now. Maybe you can tell us later. Um, if you were gonna give our educators like one suggestion in terms of not only what they should do in their life to improve their intellectual wellness, but how they can transcend this knowledge into the classroom with their students.
Mhm.
Like, what kind of advice would you give them?
In terms of what they can do themselves, do you mean like what specific activities?
Yeah, maybe. Like, is there like one thing that you think that they should focus on, or how would they maybe assess their own, like, maybe strengths or areas of growth and then
Mhm.
pull from their strength? I don't, it's like, is there something that you would have them do to start to think
Mhm.
more critically or unintentionally about their intellectual wellness and maybe even how they coach that or teach that with students?
Yeah. I mean, one thing I always recommend is for people to schedule it in their calendar.
Mm,
Like this is the time of this day that I'm going to spend 15 to 20 minutes or however much you have on my brain health.
yeah.
And what you do in that particular session will depend a little bit on kind of what you mentioned on your strengths and weaknesses. And if part of your brain health is the cognitive stuff, we all want to maintain our cognition. Unfortunately, as we age, our brains just naturally start to decline, and so we have to, we're always lagging behind and having to try and fight that off. And so that baseline level of just maintaining our brain health and warding off our aging brain, I would pick a thing that you like. And the key is that it needs to be slightly challenging. So you can't just sit down and read a book.
Mm,
You have to journal about it or have a discussion with a friend about it, and make it a little more of a challenge. Because we can do a lot of passive things like that, or we can watch like a Discovery Channel show about something we don't understand. But if you're just a passive recipient, it's not going to do much. You have to really think about it or discuss it or journal about it, and try and find like the meaning in it, to make it denser, I guess is a good way to put it. And if you're then, like most of us are, I think, today in this time that we're going through, you additionally have um, anxiety, depression, stress, um, then you're also going to want to use part of that session for some relaxation, for
yeah.
meditation, and those are brain exercises too. Again, we always separate. We're like, oh well, this is cognitive function, my memory, of course, that's important. But then like there's anxiety and depression, and we try to put it in this separate box that's separate, but they're both brain, and they're very connected to each other. And so if it's a little bit individual, if you're having that those additional symptoms, then you want to tweak your session to address those.
Okay.
That makes sense. Yeah. So
Yeah.
it's not, it's hard for me to say everyone should do this one thing, because you might not like that one thing. You could maybe do computer games, or there's
Mhm.
a question I see on the, from a listener about karate or tai chi, because it combines both movement and mental. And yes, those are perfect things. And they're also meditative. And so, if you can find something, if you are a person who likes everything to be tied into one, then that would be a perfect choice for you. Um, and in terms of applying this to the classroom, I would passionately advocate for teaching children about brain health and what it means to not only our brains help us remember things, and we're trying to exercise them, and when you learn something you actually change your brain structure, and your experiences are going to change your brain structure, and it's sometimes hard to reverse that. And so you kind of want to be uh, be healthy as much as you can, and but also teaching them about emotion,
Yep.
and that's part of brain health too, and how we cope with that, and how important it is, to be to feel open about that and to feel empathetic and accepting of those things. And I hope that's not too simple of a or expected of an answer. Somebody has asked if it would be beneficial to teach students about neuroplasticity, that they have control over their own brain health. Yes, absolutely. I think most people go through their lives not knowing that and not understanding that. And so it would be a really critical thing to teach people when they're young and starting out, and when we have them, at our disposal, to teach them about neuroplasticity and how our brains adapt for good or for ill, and we can choose which one that's going to be.
I think that is like a great spot to end what you just said, how we can choose which one we want them to be. That we actually do have some control and some choice over it, and the responsible decisions that we make in our lives, and teaching children about that's one of the 5 core SEL competencies that we think about, and when we're teaching, both academics and when we're teaching about our emotions and our intellectual health and our I think it is really important for them to understand everything that you just spoke of today, at a developmental level, and that there's choice, that they can make responsible decisions around it. So,
Yeah.
Shelly, really thank you so much for joining us today. You are seriously brilliant, and I've
Thank
learned so much
you.
from you, not just prepping for the podcast, but even just today listening to you. I've learned so much. So I am imagining that we'll stay connected in some way, shape, or
Yeah,
form.
I hope so.
And collaborate in some way. So
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm going to say before we leave, our next podcast is going to be focused on environmental wellness. And so we are going to talk about the importance of shaping our environments and systems within our environment to support our well-being, and how we can even do that in school buildings, and maybe even show you some examples of different types of schools that have kind of modified their learning environments in ways that inspire you to even just show up at school, because we know that we're having a hard time getting kids even just to show up. So we're going to focus on that next month. And then I also want to say, Kat Wilson, our marketing manager, sent me a text message during this podcast, and she's like, Carrie, we are on Spotify, Google Podcasts, and Amazon Music, and we're still waiting to get on the Apple ID approval. So Spotify, Google, and Amazon Music is what we're currently on. So thank you, Kat. I know I don't always stay up to date with that kind of information. So I really appreciate that you all joined us this evening, and I am looking forward to connecting with all of you again next month. And I hope that you can take some of this information and directly apply it in your own lives, and somehow transcend some of this knowledge into your classrooms with your students, your families, and maybe even your colleagues. So thank you, everyone. Have a really great night.
Bye.
Bye-bye.